Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be talking about survival of life on this planet and the role that humans may play to ensure not just their own survival, but the survival of the diversity of life overall, which has already been greatly reduced due to human activity. I spoke to Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Elizabeth Kolbert, who has been reporting on environmental issues for The New Yorker since 1999. In 2015, she won the Pulitzer Prize for her book, The Sixth Extinction, An Unnatural History. Her latest book is now out. It is called Under the White Sky, The Nature of the Future, and she joined me to talk about it. Are we at a point where just trying to stop further harming nature is not enough?
Well, I think we're in a really, the sort of overarching theme of the book is we're in a we've already altered the world so significantly that ceasing to alter it on some level isn't an option, because the ramifications of what we've already done are going to continue for generations, really for all intents and purposes forever in some cases. Even if we do nothing, even if we cease right now. And that's not practical, obviously, with 8 billion people on the planet, to say, oh, we're just, not going to have any more impact on the world. But let's say theoretically we could, or even theoretically if we were to just, vaporize. And so that raises, the question, which once again is central to the book, of, okay, well, do we try to correct for our own, interventions? Are there things that we could do to counteract them that would be further interventions? Or is that just, going to bring new problems and potentially even graver problems? And that is truly a question. That's not this is not like a rhetorical question. That is the question, and that the book raises, that the book explores.
It's a real catch-22, right? I mean, do we proactively try to change things, and if we do, in an attempt to try to better improve the natural condition of the earth, are there unforeseen consequences that we're not aware of yet?
Yes, I mean, one of the, a lot of the stories that I tell in the book, for example, one story centers on cane toads in Australia, and cane toads in Australia are this kind of, really dark, comic intervention in the natural world. They're toads that are native to South America and Central America, and actually the very, very southernmost tip of Texas. And they're enormous. They're sometimes mistaken for boulders, and they're highly toxic. If you eat one, you will, as a human, you will, probably die. And they were brought over in the 1930s in this, effort to control another creature, creatures, which were these beetles that were plaguing the country's sugarcane crop. And the toads probably had zero impact on the beetles, but they multiplied and spread extremely effectively. They had no predators, no, natural predators in Australia. And they're still on the move. They're still increasing their territory every year. And because they are highly toxic, because Australia's native wildlife did not evolve with them, they will eat them. They very readily, munch into them. And so we're talking snakes and lizards and marsupials, and they die. And so a lot of species have crashed in numbers because of these cane toads. And now this is a very classic example where if you do nothing, this process is just going to continue, right? The cane toads are going to continue to spread and increase their territory. And, native animals are going to continue to eat them, and they're going to continue to die. So, what's the response once you've set something like that in motion?
Has it caused any species to go extinct yet?
I don't think there are any known extinctions, but some of the species, for example, there's a very cute marsupial that's actually a predator, marsupial predator, which is interesting when you think of, marsupials as being herbivores, but obviously they aren't all herbivores. And it's called a quoll, and their numbers they're endangered for lots of reasons, and cane toads are one of them. And people are really trying to save them because they're, a key native species. Actually, there are a couple of species of quolls, but precisely because they are marsupial predators, they're important to the whole ecosystem.
This will probably be a silly question, but is in evolution probably doesn't work this way. But if you have the situation in which other species are eating this dangerous toads, these poisonous toads, is it possible that can jumpstart evolution for those species, that there will be some species that aren't killed off by the toad, they'll reproduce, or does evolution not happen on that quick of a time scale?
No, I mean, it's really interesting. It is actually turns out to be a really, interesting story of evolution in action. So on the one hand, it's been documented that the toads are evolving. Scientists noticed that they were expanding faster and faster. Their range was growing, but it was growing at an accelerating rate, and they sort of couldn't figure out why. But then they went and they looked at the toads from the original area where they'd been introduced, which was on the northeast coast of Australia, which is sugarcane country. And then they went hundreds of miles away where the toads are what's called the invasion front. You can say, okay, at this is the line, here where the toads are, and they haven't quite gotten here yet. If you took toads from the invasion front, they had much longer legs. So they had evolved this quality that had allowed them to expand more quickly. So that was, a really interesting revelation. That is evolution in action, right? Now, you also see you do see that those, not everything has been killed off by them. Some birds, it seems, have sort of figured out how to eat them in a way that they don't get the toxic, the toxin is in the pouches behind their shoulders. That's where they carry the toxin. So if you don't eat those, you're okay. So, there are things doubtless are evolving in response, but not fast enough. So this is the, real lesson of invasive species. Often you will reach some new equilibrium, but it might not involve, some species may have dropped out. They simply could not evolve fast enough. And so you have this mismatch because the toads are doing really, really well. They have no predators, so they're actually exploding. Whereas the native wildlife, they might be very slowly evolving, but just not fast enough,
Really interesting to think about, and maybe even getting back to the subtitle of your book, the nature of the future, is how, I guess, this moment that we're living through, this epoch of the Anthropocene, how that's going to drive, if life survives, how that's going to drive evolution in the future, how things look way down the line from here.
No, absolutely. And I do want to say that, I think it's a fair bet to say that life will survive. Life finds a way, as Michael Crichton so famously put it. We've had my last book, which was, called The Sixth Extinction, talks about these major mass extinction events in life's history, which, include the asteroid impact that did in the dinosaurs. And each of these 5 previous mass extinctions have done in, something like 75% of all life on Earth. That's sort of the definition. 75% of all species, I shouldn't say of all life, but of all species. And, but 25% came through. And we are, everything on Earth now, of course, is descended from whatever survived that last great extinction at the end of the Cretaceous, 66 million years ago. So, obliterating life is a task beyond, even humanity, I believe, even if we put our best effort into it. How's that? But what life will look like, millennia, millions of years from now, you choose your time frame, is being determined by us, right now, because if you cut off an evolutionary pathway, if those quals, simply cease to exist, the dodo no longer exists, we can go through the list. Obviously, they don't leave descendants, and they don't leave descendants to evolve. So one evolutionary pathway has been cut off. And that's really what we're doing. We're just cutting off these evolutionary pathways. And that whatever survives, this epoch, as you said, the Anthropocene, that will populate the world forever. There's no going back.
In a way that makes me feel slightly better. Because I'm worried about like the whole atmosphere disappearing,
Yeah,
I'm worried about becoming
you have to worry about that. The atmosphere was going to stick around, and life is going to stick around. It might not be what you wanted, and it might not involve, ways of life as we know them, but life itself is pretty robust.
Yeah. Can you explain to me a little bit more? I said the word. It doesn't mean I actually fully understand it. Anthropocene. Yeah. Can you explain that for me?
Yeah. So the Anthropocene or Anthropocene, or people pronounce it differently. They pronounce it on different land, different sides of the Atlantic. Is the name that has been given sort of informally to a new geological epoch. And geologists are very strict about, there are epochs, there are periods, and epoch is actually not that long a time. So we now currently live in the epoch that's known as the Holocene, which is the time since the last ice age. So roughly 12,000 years since the last ice age ended. And the idea of the Anthropocene is, well, we don't really live in the Holocene anymore. We live in this age where humans are determining the fate of the planet, not the usual geological forces, which are, seismic and volcanic and, plate tectonics, et cetera. So in the Anthropocene, human fingerprints are on everything. And this is being taken up, just in case anyone's interested, but formally by geologists. So it's informally sort of already been adopted, but formally, it has been taken up as a question of formal geology. Should we formally rename this epoch? And that question is still open.
It's debated. Well, what's the debate against it?
Well, the debate against it is, epochs are always, geology is a very retrospective discipline. So, you look back at the record that has been left, usually in the rocks, and then you can say after 66 million years, we said, well, the Cretaceous ended, at this point. That's what the rocks show us. Well, obviously the rock record of today doesn't exist yet. It won't exist for quite a while. So some people would say you're sort of comparing apples and oranges, to name a new epoch as it's unfolding. Another argument against renaming the epoch is, well, human impacts are only going to get greater. They're only going to get more significant. So let's wait and see. Let's wait and see what happens. So there are all sorts of internal arguments. But putting aside the really technical arguments, I think that most Earth scientists would agree that human impacts on the planet right now are dominant. There are other great forces of nature, but if you look just simply across the spectrum, what we're doing to the carbon cycle, what we're doing to the nitrogen cycle, what we're doing to other species, how much Earth we move around. Humans move around as much earth and sediment as the major river systems of the world right now. That's just an amazing fact.
Striking to really just think about carbon by itself. You can think about other things too, nitrogen, but carbon, and just how it took millions and tens of millions of years to form underneath the ground, and how in a matter of 200 years, we're putting it all back into the atmosphere.
Yeah, everything that we burn, all of our fossil fuels, natural gas, coal, oil, all of that was organic matter that was, preserved in this kind of sort of half-rotted state and sort of cooked in, just the right conditions for, as you say, over hundreds of millions of years. And at our current rates of fossil fuel consumption, for better or worse, unfortunately, the world has a lot. We're realizing now that our reservoirs of fossil fuels are huge. But, we could, at current rates of consumption, we already have gone through a lot of them, and we could go through, the bulk of them in the next few hundred years, and we would have completely, reversed. So we're sort of running geological history backwards and really, really fast by burning fossil fuels.
So you're pronouncing Anthropocene. I said Anthropocene, and then were you just being gracious and saying they're different?
Tomato, I say, yeah.
Really, were you okay? So you weren't just being gracious.
When I said Anthropocene, Americans tend to call it the Anthropocene, and Brits call it the Anthropocene. So it's just a sort of a matter of stress there.
Good. I just don't want to lead anyone astray because of my own lack of pronunciation. And this is a term that is made popular by a chemist, Paul Crutzen.
Yes, who just died a couple weeks ago. He was a Dutch chemist. He worked in Germany, I think, for most of his life, but he's most famous for having been one of a trio of scientists who warned about ozone depleting chemicals. And he, so back in the 80s and 90s, he and actually a scientist from California, Sherwood Rowland, and Mario Molina, they warned the world about what we now know as sort of CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, and how they were having, and other things that we were doing too, I should say. There were other ways that we were destroying the ozone layer. And then that was confirmed. People were very skeptical about it because it was a very complicated, calculation, actually, of what these chemicals were doing up in the stratosphere. But then these measurements were confirmed then by scientists who were astonished. I mean, the famous story about the ozone hole is that the instruments had been sort of programmed to toss out readings that were too low. And that delayed people's understanding that the ozone layer was being eaten away because the machines just didn't believe it, But when they finally realized what was going on, that's when we got, and this is one of the great, sort of environmental success stories, I would say, of the last, generation is we did get a global treaty banning CFCs. And while they do continue to be made illegally and leak out of old stuff and all that, the problem is, the situation is improving as opposed to getting worse.
Paul Crutzen would popularize the term Anthropocene in an essay called Geology of Mankind. And I learned this from you. I didn't already know this coming into this, but I did read it because it's short and easy to understand and pretty powerful. And a line, several, I can't read the whole thing, but one line that really stood out to me was towards the end. It said this, quote, "Unless there is a global catastrophe, a meteorite impact, a world war, or a pandemic, mankind will remain a major environmental force for many millennia."
Yeah. I mean, Paul Crutzen, and he's a very, very influential guy. And that essay, Geology of Mankind, which appeared in Nature, I think in 2004, that's what really introduced this term, the Anthropocene, to a general audience. And it really took off from there.
This is Letters in Politics, and we are in conversation with Elizabeth Kolbert, Pulitzer Prize winning reporter. She's been with the magazine New Yorker since 1999. Her latest book is now out. It's called Under the White Sky, The Nature of the Future. It was published earlier this month. Before, and I want to get into some things about what's happening today, especially things you dive into in this book, including the coral reefs, the Great Lakes. But I want to ask you, it seems like this pandemic for so many people has just changed things, generally speaking. And for me personally, I would say it has changed. I feel like even my own relationship and the way I see my own environment where I live, because I spend so much more time in my own environment now. Now, you've been reporting on these issues for a long time. The sixth extinction was written 2014. But has this pandemic at all changed the way you see these issues, or affected the way you see these issues that you write about?
Yeah, well, the pandemic, arrived literally just as I had fortunately for myself completed most of the reporting for Under White Sky right as the pandemic hit. I was at Harvard reporting one of the last chapters, right as the campus was closing, basically, in March of 2020. And unfortunately, so definitely, just impacted me, personally, the way it impacted everyone. But unfortunately for me, for better or worse, the pandemic has really, it seems to me, played out really right according to the patterns that I'm talking about in the book, which is, it was a combination. The whole pandemic is an result of how we live with animals. We don't know exactly how it jumped species. We don't even know what species it jumped from, but we can be quite confident it jumped from some species, either a wild animal that someone had come in contact with in a way that was unfortunate, or domesticated animals might have been a reservoir, and our domesticated animals, we know, are just a pandemic waiting to happen. Very crowded. We live in very close quarters with them. Most of our, diseases that we know of, have come from this domestication of animals. Okay, so we have this, what's called a spillover event when we get something from an animal reservoir into humans. A disease jumps into humans, and then, these are quote unquote natural events. They've always happened, right? But in other eras, they would have just sort of burned themselves out, right? If a small band of humans had eaten something that gave them a very nasty viral pathogen, they might have all died off, but that would have been the end of that because they just didn't encounter other people. But here we have a situation where so globalized, we move around so much that this pathogen was everywhere. You can go online and look at when the first recorded cases were in the Falkland Islands, on the Kamchatka Peninsula, just these very remote parts of the world. It was everywhere very soon. And then, even then, we could have, by using sort of controlling ourselves, we could have really tried to stamp it out, eradicate it, or at least get it down to very minimal levels. We did not do that. We let it completely rage out of control. And immediately pinned our hopes on a technological solution. We were going to get a vaccine. Yeah. And we actually have been very fortunate in getting vaccines as fast as we did. And they are, really using this cutting edge new technology. So they're quite amazing vaccines. But now, we are facing the prospect of what's called vaccine escape. We're getting these new variants because this virus is everywhere. It has, because, getting back to evolution, has gazillion opportunities to evolve. And so we're going to be in a perpetual kind of treadmill with COVID. I think that's becoming, I'm not an epidemiologist, but I think epidemiologists would tell you this disease has now become endemic. It's now in other animals, right? So we know it's in mink, other species, and it's going to constantly, we now have all these reservoirs, we're going to constantly get new forms of COVID.
Yeah, and I get the parallels to what you're writing about is can we conquer nature to save nature almost?
Exactly.
I want to dive into your reporting about the coral reefs. Really fascinating and probably still not well understood. I've seen a couple of David Attenborough documentaries about it, quite beautiful. But something that I think is really important to understand, we talk about climate change, and we always talk about climate change about global warming and the Earth's temperature. But there is, I guess, what we call an evil twin to the increase in temperatures, and that would be the increase of carbon in the ocean that makes it more acidic, which is a major threat to the ocean itself, which of course is the vast majority of ocean covers the vast majority of the planet.
Yeah, so ocean acidification, this, as you say, is sometimes called global warming's equally evil twin, and it's a function of the fact that a lot of the carbon that we pour into the atmosphere very quickly, the water, this is just sort of basic, chemistry, the water has got to be in equilibrium with the air, in terms of, gases in the water and gases in the atmosphere. So as we pour CO2 into the air, we're actually also forcing it into the oceans. And when CO2 dissolves in water, it forms an acid, carbonic acid. And if you drink a Coke today, or if you have a glass of club soda, you're drinking it. It's a weak acid, but if you pour enough of it, any acid, into the oceans, it's going to change the chemistry of the oceans. And this took scientists actually a fairly long time to get their minds around, because the oceans are so huge and they're very well buffered. The assumption was, well, they're very well buffered. They'll sort of manage to neutralize this. But we're pumping so much CO2 into the air that we've really taxed the ocean's ability to neutralize this. So the pH of the oceans is falling. This is very well documented. This is not, A, it's not rocket science, and B, it's weirdly, even though there's, always this ridiculous debate about climate change, there's never debate about ocean acidification. Ocean acidification is happening. Climate change is also happening, but anyway, this is just beyond dispute. And one group of organisms that we know, doesn't like acidification, and it also really doesn't like, I should say, it really doesn't like warming. It may not even have, time to get hit by acidification, because already we're seeing that corals, reef-building corals, which are these tiny little gelatinous animals. I mean, they're very interesting creatures that basically consist of just a mouth and some tentacles. They build these incredible structures, that we call reefs, and they don't like warm water, and they don't like low pH water. And so both of these things are causing reefs. Reefs are in trouble. I mean, I'm sure most of your listeners know this. So over the last 3 decades, something like, half the corals on the Great Barrier Reef, which is the world's largest reef system, have disappeared. So that's, extremely ominous.
Yeah. A mouth and tentacles. I guess that's all you need, right?
Seriously. Yes, exactly. You need to take in food, and you need to excrete food, and you need to reproduce. That's pretty much it. Yeah.
What are the efforts in trying to save the corals, especially about what you write about? What are humans actively trying to do?
So I have a chapter in the book, as you in Under White Sky, on coral reefs, on efforts to save coral reefs, because, and this very much fits the pattern of the book. So the pattern of the book is, well, we do something. In this case, we've warmed the oceans and we've changed their chemistry, and we get a result that we really don't like, which is that reefs are in trouble. And I should point out that, many millions of people depend on reefs, for fish, for food, for coastline protection, but, potentially even more significantly, something like a quarter of all marine species spend at least part of their life cycle on a reef. So this is huge. Ecologically, it couldn't be huger. So the question of, okay, well, we've warmed the oceans, we've changed their chemistry. We're not getting that back, right? You're not getting that heat out of the ocean, even if you were to, this gets back to sort of what we were talking about before, even if you were to just stop emitting carbon, you still have warmed the oceans, and they're still going to continue to warm. So scientists in Hawaii and Australia, the ones that I visited, came up with this idea of, okay, well, if we want reefs of the future, we're going to have to manipulate reefs. We've changed the oceans. Now we're going to have to change reef building corals too, so that they can adapt to this new world. And what they were doing was it had several prongs, but one of the easiest ones to get your mind around is they were basically just trying to hybridize, crossbreed corals from different parts of the Great Barrier Reef, for example, to see if some of the offspring, there's this phenomenon that's called hybrid vigor, we all have hybrid crops. So we all know about hybrids. If some of the offspring would be more heat tolerant than their parents. So that was one avenue that they were pursuing. But on the Great Barrier Reef itself, people are pursuing all sorts of ideas. They're trying to figure out if they could brighten clouds so that would bounce sunlight back to space and cool parts of the reef. Or could you put like a plastic film over the reef as a sunshade? It just, some of these ideas are, they sound, honestly, they sound a little wacky, but they're pretty serious. And some of them might work. But then you get into the question, which is also one of the big questions of the book, of scale. The Great Barrier Reef is the size of Italy. So, if you imagine, well, a plastic shade, could do some good, and then you imagine a plastic shade the size of Italy, the mind boggles, I guess.
I mean, listening to you, I can't help, even though the book was written over 200 years ago by Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, I can't help but think of the moral of that story.
Yeah, I mean, Frankenstein and our ability to, create and manipulate, Frankenstein is always is one of our great classics, because I think it gets at this phenomenon that we keep encountering over and over again. You create something, you don't control it. You create it, but you don't control it. Dr. Frankenstein does not control the monster. And that is the problem.
When they were creating cars, they probably weren't thinking about potential extinction of life in the ocean.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the weird characteristics of the Anthropocene is that what we take as completely ordinary life, right? I'm going to go to see my kid in a soccer game. I'm going to get in the car and drive. What is enabling that to happen is, some creature that lived, 100 million years ago that got caught in some weird geological formation that is now oil, that is now pumped from God knows where, halfway around the world, that ended up in the tank of your car. That's actually, when you think of that, the long history of life on this planet is a pretty amazing event. And that, if I really would get at sort of the heart of what I'm trying to get at in Under a White Sky, it is what an amazing time we live in, where, what we think of as perfectly ordinary is actually unprecedented in the history of life on Earth, which goes back, 3.5 billion years.
Like we are at the nexus of
Exactly.
the past and what's going to come in the future.
Exactly. And it's kind of an interesting, twist on, a lot of science over the last several hundred years, as historians of science would point out, has been sort of decentering humans. The Earth, the sun doesn't revolve around the Earth revolves around the sun. We are not created, we're not some special animal. We evolved just like all other animals, Darwin. Now recent revelations that there are, millions of potentially habitable planets out there. So, we keep being told that our planet and our essence are not, different from anything else. But one of the messages that we also have to be willing to confront at the same time, it seems to me, is actually on planet Earth, which is so far is the only planet we have that we know has life, and it's certainly the only planet that has human life. We are very, very important. We are able to, it turns out that we are not like other animals, and that we are able to change the world very fast, very dramatically, in ways that other species really can't cope with.
And that gets us again back to this catch-22 that we've been talking about. You try to tinker with things to see if you can make them more sustainable or preserve them. You don't know how it's going to turn out. It can turn out very bad. But if you do nothing, it can also turn out very, very bad. And if we're going to be practical about it, at least at this moment, it doesn't seem like it's a possibility where we're just going to stop all, industrial activity.
No, it doesn't seem very likely, does it?
Yeah. No.
Yeah, no, I think that is, that's the predicament we're in, and that's precisely the subject of the book. We are in a predicament. I think we need to be at least be honest about that.
And you don't have the answers, and that's important.
I really don't have the answers. I mean, I think that the book begins with certain interventions that I think people would say, oh yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. That makes sense. That makes sense. And it sort of takes you along this road until you get to, this sort of ultimate intervention, which is called solar geoengineering, which is the source of the title, Under White Sky, which is this idea that, we have poured so much CO2 into the atmosphere that we may one day be faced with very, very, very bad options, one of which would be to try to counteract the warming that we've caused by dumping a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere by dumping more stuff into the stratosphere that would reflect sunlight back to space and have a cooling effect. And interestingly enough, since we were talking about Paul Crutzen, about 15 years ago, Paul Crutzen wrote a paper saying, we need to look at this. We're going to need to look at this seriously because we are screwing things up so badly. And that was a very interesting moment, for scientists sort of in that area, because here was the guy who had warned about ozone depletion saying, well, we may have to screw around with the stratosphere. So people really sat up and took notice when Paul Crutzen said that.
And geoengineering could turn our skies white. Hence the actual title of your book. I've been so focused on your subtitle, but
yes. So one of the many possible side effects of pouring reflective particles into the stratosphere could be, depending on what you use, I should say, and depending on how much of it you use. But it could be the scientists have done calculations that suggest pretty robustly that the appearance of the sky would change and the sky would appear whiter.
Almost seems appropriate to me, actually. And I would hate for that to happen. I mean, after preparing for our conversation, I've been staring at the sky a lot, to be honest.
Well, you may already be looking at in urban centers already, right? We don't have a clear shot at the sky. I mean, there's a lot of haze and there's a lot of probably sky whitening already going on. So I do want to be fair. But anyway, yeah.
But for me, I was going to say appropriate in the sense of it's not so visible, the global warming. I mean, it is becoming more so, right, with the fires we have here, what we saw happen in the middle of the country with the temperatures this past week. But up until very recently, we didn't have a lot of visuals to inform people.
Yeah, and I think that's a big problem. I mean, someone, and I'm sorry that I can't remember who it was, suggested that, if carbon dioxide were purple, and we saw that the skies were becoming more and more purple, we're just surrounded by purple, we'd wake up and be alarmed. But because carbon dioxide is invisible and it's also, not, you're breathing it out every minute, it's not harmful per se. It just happens to have this impact of, warming the world. We would not be here without it. And we wouldn't be here without the greenhouse gases that make the world habitable. I mean, without some greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, we would have a frozen planet. But, what we're doing is just adding more. We're just going to get, once again, the idea that we've had, decades of debate over climate change is just, comical and ridiculous, because we've known what the effect of carbon dioxide is for a century and a half at least. And we know that it traps heat near the surface of the earth, which is, good in moderation. And the more you put up there, the hotter it's going to get. It's not a simple calculation, but a first order approximation, that's all you need to know.
I asked you earlier if the pandemic has shifted at all the way you see the things you write about. And the reason I think I asked that, because it's shifted everything, but also for me, it has been, I think, profound for me, because now I've basically been in the same neighborhood without being able to leave for a year. But I'm also very fortunate. I told you this before we went on air. I live just a couple of blocks from a lake. It's called Lake Merritt. It was the first wildlife refuge in North America, declared in 1870. They weren't necessarily worried about wildlife. They were more worried about hunting accidents. But 10 years ago, they started completing renovations to the lake. They put millions of dollars in it, cleaned the lake up, and it has been, I think, a success. We've seen more life. There's always been life there, but more life return to the lake. And for me, it's just, and I've been spending more time in local gardens and stuff, and it's just sort of, it kind of in a way gives me hope of like, okay, wait a minute, we can we may not have the nature of the past, but we can create a new nature. We can create more sustainable. I'm for preserving what's still around, but we can also make our cities, our urban areas, more habitable for life with gardens, rooftop gardens, trees, whatever it may be. I mean, I saw a documentary about Singapore as being a place that has done this pretty well in their development. Is that a possibility that we just have to recreate a sense of nature to preserve nature?
Well, there are, I mean, there are proposals, and it was part of Biden's platform. I think it was like it's this phrase, 30% by 2030. Can we preserve, protect? The definition is a little bit vague what that means, but 30% of the land and water in the U.S. by 2030. There's a proposal. There are proposals. E.O. Wilson has a book called Half Earth. Should we put half of the land on Earth is basically aside? It doesn't mean it's not going to change, because it is going to change because of climate change, just for one. But at least then, and this sort of gets back to what we were talking about before, if you gave creatures sort of space to migrate, for example, a lot of species are on the move because the climate's changing. They need to sort of track the climate. They need to move. If you put aside enough space for them, you would sort of get the maximum number of species through this very difficult period. Let's just pause it for a minute, that the next century is sort of maximum human impacts on the planet. We don't know that that's true, but we could imagine in a best case scenario that would be true. How do you get as many species as possible through what E.O. Wilson, once again, to quote the great E.O. Wilson, has called the bottleneck? This is sort of a bottleneck. And when you think about it, giving species sort of space and time to evolve would obviously be, optimal. Now, are we prepared to do this? Are we going to put 50% of the world aside? Once again, right now, the answer seems, well, no, we're not really willing to do this. We fight over every attempt. I mean, Trump, during the Trump administration, they actually cut the size of national monuments. And, now Biden will have to, it's a very complicated legal question of can you restore them? So we're just fighting over I don't want to say over every inch, but over every square mile. And, 50% of the earth is a lot of territory. And a lot of that territory, and where it would be most important, to be honest, is in the tropics, because the tropics are the most biodiverse spots on Earth. That's, just a fact. And, so the US doesn't control them. We're not a tropical country. Are we going to can we tell, the Brazilians, can we tell the countries in equatorial Africa, well, you need to put aside half of your land? Well, we didn't put aside half of our land. Why should they?
Yeah. And again, just the importance of right now. Every time we do a show about this, I'll end up getting emails about population, human population, the number of people on this planet. My understanding is most people who study the populations believe that our population will slow, or is already starting to slow, but will really top off here within the next 100 years. So it's almost a question of, can we get from here to there?
Yes, I mean, that is the sort of, as it were, right, best case scenario, that we are in this moment of demographic transition. I mean, population is actually right now growing very fast, because even countries that have brought their birth rates down significantly, let's say like a country like Brazil, they have very young populations. So they have a big cohort of, childbearing people who will, over the next 30 years or whatever, presumably, if life goes on as it has, produce a lot of kids. And so you have this sort of bulge moving through the system, but eventually the sort of latest UN projections are sort of by the end of the century, human population should level off, and at a very high level, once again, barring catastrophe, at 10 billion people, and then start to decline. So yes, the idea would be, this is the time of maximum population, the next century, let's say, and it sort of follows from that, hopefully, the time of maximum human impacts. Though, one point that's important to stress is that, people of the world, the number of people is only one part of this equation. It's also how much people consume, right? So, you could have a smaller population that was consuming more and doing just as much damage. And you also have, those of us in the developed world who do consume a lot and have fairly low birth rates at this point, doing a lot of damage, a lot more damage than countries where the birth rate is much lower, but people are not out of choice, but are compelled to live much lower down the food chain, et cetera. And each person in America, I don't know how many people's impacts you have, how many Americans, how many, let's say, Bangladeshis, it takes to equal the sort of ecological impact of, one of us here in the US.
I'm thinking back to my biology course in college, and I did not major in biology, which I think has been obvious in our conversation.
No, you've done quite well. I didn't major in biology either, as you pointed out.
But you spent many years covering it. I have not. But final question here, and I know I indicated that last time, but this time I mean it. But what I remember is, studying the web of life. And, you could lose some species within that web of life, and things will still mostly go along. But there comes a point where you just lose so much, and it's all interconnected, that at some point it endangers everyone. Are humans in danger by the loss of the diversity of life on this planet?
I think that's a really key question. Once again, questions without answers.
Yeah.
We're very adaptable. We're very clever. We have all sorts of fancy technologies, but one thing we seem to be even seeing a crisis among insects, which are a group that you would think would be pretty tough. They have very short reproductive season. They can produce many generations a season. Many creatures, many insects, they produce a lot of offspring. Go on. If anything, should be able to sort of survive the ways we're changing the earth. You'd think it would be insects, but there's pretty good evidence that a lot of insect species are having a hard time and crashing numbers. And insects, once again, to quote Ed Wilson, insects, it's the little things that rule the world. Without insects, you could do without elephants. It would be tragic, and, none of us would want to live in that world. But I think it's pretty clear that, and they are ecosystem engineers. It would change things, but we would, humans would go on. But, without some species of insects that are big pollinators, and then the world really starts to change in very, very fundamental ways. And do those fundamental ways start to really threaten food production and rather crucial, ecosystem functions? That is a question that a lot of people are thinking about. It's not some futuristic nightmare scenario. It's potentially a near-term nightmare scenario, but I don't think we have the answer to that at this point. Unfortunately, here's what I will say as the last thing to say. Unfortunately, we are answering these questions by doing. We're doing exactly what you wouldn't do, which you wouldn't advise a civilization to do, which is to run a massive planetary experiment for which there's no control and for which there's no escape, from which there's no escape. So that's not how you would go about doing anything if you were sort of a sensible person, but that's what we're doing on a planetary scale.
Elizabeth Kolbert has been our guest. She has joined us for a conversation on her latest book. It's called Under the White Sky, The Nature of the Future. It was published earlier this month. Elizabeth Kolbert, I appreciate very much you taking this time to join us today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.